This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Emerging market stocks were pretty mixed today, though we did see MSCI's index of emerging market shares rising 0.3% on the day. Now, today was a mixture of optimism about stimulus measures globally, as well as concerns about the effectiveness of a potential coronavirus vaccine. That's after some doubts have risen. Now, South Africa's JSE was subdued as that risk sentiment waned today. In Nigeria, Dangote Cement and Boa Cement were up almost 2%, lifting the oil share over 1% on the day. Also, the banking sector fared well, with the likes of GT Bank, Stanbic and Zenith topping today's gainers list. Also coming up on today's show. African countries decry neglect by developed nations in the fight against coronavirus. And African nations to consider free trade of essential goods as the implementation date of the AfCFTA is postponed. And we look at the app that's enabling Zimbabweans in South Africa to beat restricted cross-border movements and send food home. Well, let's kick off today's show in Kenya. The country is set to receive a $1 billion loan from the World Bank. The funding is Kenya's largest windfall from the Washington-based lender on record. It will help the East African economy address its widening budget deficit that has seen the government implement revenue-cutting measures. Now, earlier this month, the IMF also lent out a similar $739 million direct loan to Kenya through its rapid credit facility. Now, the funds will cater for the country's urgent balance of payment needs following the COVID-19 pandemic. Kenya has been banking on its development partners to meet its expenditure needs as tax revenues shrink from economic disruptions, of course, brought on by the global health emergency. Meanwhile, African leaders are saying that wealthy nations are failing the continent as it battles COVID-19. Now, developed economies have channeled trillions of dollars into health initiatives and economic stimulus at home. However, presidents from Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Sierra Leone, Senegal and Niger now say that's not the case for them, with pledges of financial support and debt relief falling short. While Africa has recorded just a fraction of the world's COVID-19 cases, it has been hit hard by the economic fallout from global trade disruptions, as well as falling oil and commodity prices, and of course, lockdowns. Well, let's get some perspective on this. We're joined by Katie Gregory now. She's in New York. Great to have you on the show with us, Katie. Now, of course, we know the G20 did back a call from the IMF and World Bank for a suspension of bilateral debt services for some of the world's poorest nations, some of them in Africa. What has happened with that since then?
Yeah, so we know this decision to freeze both principal repayments and interest payments would reportedly free up this over $20 billion for the world's poorest countries. That's to spend on improving their health systems and fighting the coronavirus pandemic. Now, this debt suspension is expected to last until the end of the year, with potential then for an extension. The World Bank and the IMF, as we know, have already been providing additional funding as well. That's in the form of more loans. But here's where the problem is. You know, interest by countries in taking up this debt relief has actually been really low, and not all African countries actually qualify for it. So according to the IMF, for over 77 countries that are eligible, only 22 have actually requested the debt relief so far. Now, The organisation says some nations are really hesitant to seek this debt relief. That's because of fear over what it would do to their credit ratings and future potential access to markets as well. As we know, Kenya, for example, said it wouldn't be seeking the suspension on debt payments because the terms were too restrictive. But on the other hand, South Africa has been, approaching international financial institutions to contribute to a multi-billion-dollar rescue package. Now, there is this argument that debt relief is just prolonging the inevitable here, and that it would put African countries' access to capital at risk going forward. But in response to all of this, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva says she's not pushing countries to accept this relief. She just wants the option on the table. But that's what is now leading to calls for potentially a different type of funding assistance for those hardest hit nations. Africa in particular is calling for this $100 billion in stimulus package from wealthy nations. Also, forgiveness of that bilateral debt and a suspension of private debt service, Uche.
Mm-hmm. Well, Katie, how much stimulus has Africa been able to access so far? What are the figures showing us? And certainly, what does this reveal about the ability of foreign nations to bolster aid at a time that they're struggling, their economies are struggling as well?
Yeah, of course, that is the issue, isn't it? So, look, there's no denying Africa will be hard hit by this pandemic, not just in terms of infection, but also in terms of economies ravaged, of course, by oil and commodities price fluctuation. There's also no doubt at the moment, as you say, aid purses are falling short of what is going to be needed. And that perhaps tells us a bit about the ability level of developed nations to really contribute right now as they stabilise their own economies, some of which are still actually going through the peak of this coronavirus pandemic. Now, just today, in fact, the UN says Africa will need an additional $200 billion in support from the international community. And that's part of this global response package that it's calling for, which would amount to at least 10% of the world's gross domestic product. And looking specifically here, where I am in the US, the government has already committed to providing over $1 billion. That's in terms of international coronavirus relief and through its US aid program. And over $170 million of that, I believe, is already going to African nations. Now, President Trump committed to providing thousands of ventilators. The first shipment of those went to South Africa earlier this month. And aid also comes in the form of sending infectious disease experts to regions worst hit to train local staff on the ground as well. Also to bolster those programs already in place on the ground in Africa. Now, the US has donated ambulances and hospital beds, for example, to Namibia. So the assistance is flowing, but certainly calls are growing louder for the US and for Europe in particular to do more here.
Well, many thanks for those insights, Katie. That's Katie Gregory joining us in New York. Well, let's get Africa's perspective on the discussion now. We're joined by economist Langa Madonko. He joins us via Skype. Great to have you on the show with us, sir. Now, give us a sense of what you have observed since, of course, the G20 made that move to back a call from the IMF and World Bank for a suspension of bilateral debt service for some of the world's poorest nations, some of them, of course, in Africa. What's your take on what's happened so far?
Oh, thank you for having me on the show. I think one of the things that we note about this is Africa itself, when the pandemic hit, and after a while of the lockdowns, and we started seeing the number of infections rising and deaths, Africa put the number that was estimated in terms of what we'd need as a continent to stimulate the economy post-COVID at about 100 billion US dollars. And I think we then put that into perspective as to what the debt suspension actually means for Africa. And it means a relief of about 14 billion US dollars in debt repayments for this year. And that's considerably less than what Africa needs in order for it to stimulate the economy to the extent that is required. And we all know that Africa is fast reaching a point where the debt to GDP ratio is at about 60%, and therefore this in of itself will not be sufficient in order for us to push forward in the way that we need to. And for some of the poorest countries in Africa, we know that in order for them to be able to do what they are required to do to stimulate the economy, they can't really tap into their own local fiscus or into the local market for this, and they'll need injections from offshore. So we need to hear a more concerted voice about how the wealthier nations are going to come to the party in terms of supporting this additional aid. I'm aware that certain countries have already received some backing from the IMF and from the World Bank in terms of um, injections of capital, but I don't think it will be enough. And I think the projections for job losses on the African continent are as high as 30 million people losing their jobs. And this will put Africa into an even more dire position than what it has been in historically. And we really need to hear a more concerted voice about how we're going to be dealing with this, particularly from the wealthier nations that can support the stimulus of the African economy.
Well, what is your take on this view that African nations that do qualify for debt relief are now reluctant to go after it? Some say they fear how it could impact their future access to capital markets, for example. Do you think that's the case?
Look, I think what we were all looking for when COVID hit, as the African continent, was not necessarily debt suspension, but it was more along the lines of debt relief. Because what it fundamentally means is that while you will not, debt suspension rather, while you will not be paying the interest that is due, the interest continues to run and your debt profile continues to increase. And a lot of the countries are already quite close to the precipice in terms of their ability to repay. And adding on additional debt to them just increases the amount of money that they will have to repay and reduces the amount of money that they're able to spend on the local economies. And I think a lot of the African leaders are aware of the fact that post this, you actually need to start to reform the economies. You actually need to inject more capital to kickstart infrastructure programs, to kickstart social programs that will be able to support the economy. And if they borrow now, there is, of course, yes, naturally a reluctance because you understand that it impacts your total debt to GDP ratio and limits your ability to borrow into the future. And I think that then precipitated the reluctance to go and access these funds that have been said to be available, except for the countries that looking at their balance sheets and looking at where they were in terms of trade historically found themselves better off than others.
Now, this feels like we're largely looking to institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and, of course, G20 nations. But China is widely regarded as Africa's single largest creditor. Now, as their political season, the two sessions, is currently underway, what do you expect to see from the country in terms of debt relief, debt restructuring, and maybe debt forgiveness going forward?
So I think it's already been put out that China will not be looking in the direction of debt cancellation and will probably be looking more in the direction of debt relief. And I think one of the things that we've noted about China and its style in terms of negotiation is that it will accept, for example, as has been the case in this instance, that there is a need for debt suspension and some form of debt relief for African countries. But China has a tendency and a propensity to want to negotiate with the different countries on an individualistic basis. And I think that's one of the themes that we'll see start to come out, where China will want to deal with each nation on a one-on-one basis and not take a blanket approach. And I think in some instances that may be deemed to be prudent. But I think in of itself, the fact that we have a general concession towards the fact that there is a need for this suspension and this relief is a positive sign. We can only hope and pray that China will take it a step further and in some instances cancel some of the debt that the African nations have.
Well, we're certainly watching. Many thanks for your insights, Mr. Madonko. That's Langa Madonko. He's an economist joining us there via Skype. Well, let's now turn our attention to corporate headlines for the day. Healthcare giant Johnson & Johnson will stop selling its talc-based Johnson's baby powder in the US and Canada. The firm says demand for the product has been declining in North America. As of March, more than 19,000 lawsuits have been filed against Johnson & Johnson, with plaintiffs alleging that the talc-based baby powder caused their babies cancer. Now, Johnson & Johnson, however, has consistently defended the safety of its talc products. Meanwhile, Facebook is making a major new push into e-commerce. The company has announced the launch of Shops, a way for businesses to set up free storefronts on Facebook and Instagram. The new service will make it easier for businesses forced to close and those struggling due to COVID-19 to display and sell their products. Meanwhile, Uber has cut 3,000 jobs from its workforce, its second major wave of layoffs in 2 weeks, as of course COVID-19 slashes demand for rides. Uber's last round of cuts on May 6th affected about 3,700 employees, which was 14% of its workforce at the time. This new round of cuts will leave the company with about 20,000 employees now, based on its latest available headcount figures. Uber shares were up as much as 9% on the news. And finally, Britain's Rolls-Royce plans to cut more than a sixth of its workforce. The cuts will go predominantly from the company's civil aerospace business, which generates over half of its $18 billion annual revenues. Now, Rolls-Royce, which makes engines for planes such as the Boeing 787 and Airbus 350, also says it could close its factories. That is, as it shrinks to fit the smaller market, it expects to emerge from the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let us take a short break now, still coming up on the show. We look at how viable cryptocurrencies are as a safe haven. And African nations will consider free trade of essential goods as the implementation date of the AFCFTA is postponed.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
Beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Naidoo. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back. Now, some believe that there is now growing trust in Bitcoin over traditional investments such as gold, stocks, and even real estate. They now claim to prove a notion that faith in large financial institutions has been steadily waning for more than a decade now, and the COVID-19 pandemic has only accelerated this process. Now, Luno, a global cryptocurrency platform, has unveiled a new report that explores the opportunity presented by cryptocurrencies in Africa. The firm says that high inflation rates, volatile currencies, as well as a lack of banking infrastructure, combined with a growing young and mobile native population, makes Africa ideal for the rapid adoption of cryptocurrencies. Well, let's take that apart further with Luno's GM for Africa, Maurice Ritz. He now joins us via Skype. Great to have you on the show with us, Mr. Reitz. Now, Africa may be ideal for the rapid adoption of cryptos, but what have you seen so far in terms of the sentiment towards cryptos and, of course, the overall interest in cryptos on the continent, especially given the current situation, coronavirus outbreak, and, of course, a collapse in the oil markets? What have you seen?
If we look back over the past couple of years, we've seen a steady growth in cryptocurrency awareness and ownership levels, especially in Luna's two main African markets, in Nigeria and South Africa, but also in countries such as Kenya, Ghana, with fast-growing cryptocurrency communities. These markets often rank in the top 10 when it comes to crypto Google search trends. And so for us, Africa, more than any other continent, has a need for the utility of cryptocurrencies, specifically using Bitcoin for inter-Africa payments as a cost-effective and secure alternative to traditional remittances. And that is where consumers often pay up to 10% in fees. So we think that this use case, this payments use case, will be one of the main catalysts for Bitcoin adoption over the next 5 years or so.
Well, tell us a little bit more about how do cryptos reach their full potential in Africa going forward?
Cryptocurrencies present an ideal antidote to many of the financial challenges in Africa, namely rapid inflation and high costs of transacting and also doing business across the continent. So when cryptocurrency offers people a better alternative to normal currencies, when they see it as a better store of value and as a safer and also more cheaper means of transacting with each other, they will start to use it, and that is why we think that the growth will be driven from a grassroots level up. So although there are powerful catalysts to drive the adoption of cryptocurrencies, there are some major challenges that still needs to be overcome, namely the lack of internet coverage, low smartphone penetration, access to safe and secure cryptocurrency platforms, that's very important, and also resistance from regulators and governments. But the good news is that over the past couple of years, we've made very good progress, and we're seeing very good progress being made as we speak on all these fronts, but it will take time.
Well, before we even talk about the adoption on the continent, some are questioning whether cryptocurrencies are still too young to withstand an event such as the coronavirus pandemic and, of course, the resulting global recession. We've seen cryptos such as Bitcoin falling since the start of the year. So what are your thoughts on those views?
Yes, cryptocurrency is a new technology, and therefore it is risky. But you are quite right. Bitcoin was created after the previous global recession in 2008, 2009, and is yet to fully withstand or endure a financial crisis. We're in the middle of one currently, and Bitcoin has performed well in comparison to other asset classes. Since the initial crash in March, when all the financial markets crashed, Bitcoin has recovered all of its losses and is one of the best performing assets globally for the year to date. With the main reason for this being a growing interest in Bitcoin due to it operating on a deflationary model, meaning that gradually less and less Bitcoin will be released until supply stops completely. Now, that is different from fiat currencies, which use an inflationary model where central banks can print extra units of currency at will. But what makes this more significant this year is that for the first time, Bitcoin's annual inflation rate will drop to a percentage lower than gold and traditional currencies. So that has attracted a lot of traditional investors wanting to hedge against inflation risk.
Well, then what is your outlook for cryptos, especially as an asset class? Do you see it replacing traditional investments such as gold? Could it become a safe haven asset? Where do you see it going, especially on the continent?
Yes, I think Bitcoin is still a new asset class, only being around for 10 or so years, compared to gold, for example, with more than a 1,000-year track record. But although Bitcoin's value decreased along with other assets in financial markets, it has actually done so at a far lower rate compared to many other assets and has recovered from all of its losses. Bitcoin has also been uncorrelated to assets such as stocks and bonds and gold as well for most part of its history. But so some will say it's a safe haven asset, but I think we need a little bit more data. We need more than 10 years to support this view fully. But for this year, we are seeing a lot of positive signs in the market. We're seeing momentum with new interest transaction volumes increasing, new account openings on Luno's platform increasing as well over the last 2 quarters. And I think perhaps we are entering a new medium to longer term upward trend. But it is worth noting that Bitcoin is still extremely volatile, and therefore I think any prospective investor should act with a little bit of caution as well.
Well, we are certainly watching. Many thanks for your insights there. That was Maurice Rates. He is Luno's GM for Africa. Well, let's move on now. The implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area deal has suffered a major setback due, of course, to the coronavirus pandemic. The Free Trade Area was set to be launched in July this year, but that has now been postponed indefinitely. And some analysts, however, say the COVID-19 pandemic still provides an opportunity to begin implementing the free trade of essential goods and services. Here's CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai reporting from Accra.
A landmark free trade agreement was meant to be up and running by July, but following the outbreak of the coronavirus, officials could not move in to the secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area in Ghana's capital, Accra. The launch has now been postponed.
If we don't pay particular attention going forward to the impact of the potentially disruptive impact of health issues on trade, we will not be doing justice to ourselves. And so that is a matter that we have agreed with the CDC in the implementation of the agreement to look at how we can mitigate the risk caused by pandemics on trade.
The African Continental Free Trade Area is expected to open the market for 1.3 billion people and boost intra-African trade. With border closures and the restrictions of movement of people caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, trade among African countries has been badly hit. But some analysts say the free trade agreement could still be implemented amidst the pandemic with focus on essential goods, including drugs and personal protective equipment.
We have agreed to have a free trade area. It can continue. The only phases and areas that need to be suspended for the time being, those are maybe the ones that they have to recommend. And let's say free movement of people, which have been affected now. You can't be moving from one country to another. But goods and services, now cargoes are being done. So a political decision can be made by the health system. Okay, let's trading still commence maybe in September or October, but for these areas.
While member countries have taxes waived on 90% of goods, they have yet to submit a list for the 10% of goods that will attract taxes, something analysts want done before the Secretariat sets a new launch date.
With the deferment of the commencement of the trading, it gives governments across Africa enough time to work with their private sectors, trade union organizations to identify what constitutes 10% exclusion list, so that once trading starts next year, there wouldn't be anything back and forth.
Analysts suggest that these negotiations with member countries be done virtually through video conferencing. The Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area has yet to disclose when it will launch the agreement, but some experts are predicting next year. Meanwhile, with the implementation challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic, analysts say it's become critical to allow free trade of essential goods to reduce the impact of the health crisis on the continent. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Now, South Africa's alcohol ban is taking a toll not just on drinkers, but on the entire liquor industry. The country's glass packaging sector could see production come to a standstill. That is, as the ban chips away at the merits of running factories. CGTN Sumitra Naidu reports from Johannesburg.
From farming to manufacturing, to bottling, to labeling, and even distribution, the entire liquor industry value chain is being affected by this ban. The glass industry alone has lost 80% of its revenue since the lockdown started.
We sell about between 82 to 85% of our products to the alcohol industry. And without the alcohol industry, it means that we are only able to sell around about 15 to 18% of our products.
A baptism of fire for Isanti Glass. The company recently acquired the Nampak glass packaging division in an $83 million deal that took effect on the 1st of April.
As much as we are not selling to most of our customers, we basically keeping our furnaces running. So which means that we've got high fixed costs in terms of energy usage and labor, because to run the furnaces, we use a lot of gas, electricity, and all the stuff. As much as we're not selling to our main customers, we keep on burning cash.
The glass industry employs around 26,000 people and contributes over $650 million to the economy annually. The bulk of the contracts are for bottling beer and wine.
For the month of April, glass sales dropped by 90% because of the ban on alcoholic beverages. So our activities in terms of supporting small businesses has really been affected. But coupled with that, the buyback centers where people sell their glass to, they have not been able to operate. And because of the tough times of the glass manufacturers, they cannot buy any glass at the moment. So the entire upstream supply chain has come to a complete standstill.
Bottle stores have been closed for 8 weeks thus far, and still there's no news as to when they will be able to reopen. There is talk of easing restrictions once South Africa moves down to level 3 in June, but it still won't make up for the losses suffered in this industry. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
You are watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a quick break now, but still coming up on the show. US President Donald Trump's threat to withdraw funding for the WHO was based on inaccurate details. And we look at some of China's recently launched laws and further reforms to open up its economy.
No one again, he can hold in guns. Machine guns from police forces towards the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Business in Africa is at the crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
Just about 1:30, let's recap today's top headlines. South Africa has begun a clinical trials to investigate if a dose of the BCG vaccine can be used in the fight against coronavirus. If successful, officials say this could give the continent a cheap weapon in order to deter the spread of COVID-19. Now, the vaccine, widely used for tuberculosis, is also undergoing testing in the Netherlands and Australia to see if it can protect against the virus. And Burundians have voted in the country's crucial general elections despite the coronavirus outbreak. President Pierre Nkurunziza is expected to step down after 15 years. The election, if successful, will usher in the first democratic transition since independence. If no candidate secures a 50% majority in the first round, a runoff will take place within 2 weeks. Now, citizens are electing their president and members of parliament and communal council members. And the United States has killed 2 al-Shabaab fighters after resuming an aerial offensive in Somalia. The attack took place in Kunyabaro, an agricultural town in the Lower Shabelle region. It is the first strike to be conducted by the U.S. military in Somalia in over a month. And lastly, Southern African nations have pledged to assist Mozambique fight insurgents who pose an increasingly complex threat to the region. The leaders of Botswana, Zambia and Mozambique made the declaration after a meeting hosted on Tuesday by Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa. And that's a recap of today's top headlines. Well, let's turn now to international news. One of the top peer-reviewed medical journals in the world, Lancet, has rebutted claims by U.S. President Donald Trump that the World Health Organization had consistently ignored reports of COVID-19 spreading in China. That's including reports from the journal. Lancet says Trump's claims are factually incorrect and that it published no report in December 2019 referring to a virus or outbreak in Wuhan or anywhere else in China. Now from the White House, here's CGTN's Nathan King with the latest, including reaction to news that Trump is taking a malaria drug to protect himself against COVID-19.
Just hours after many world leaders called the WHO vital in fighting the pandemic and China's president pledged an extra $2 billion, US President Trump sent a blistering and inaccurate letter to the global health body threatening to withdraw in 30 days unless unspecified reforms were made.
They have to clean up their act. They have to do a better job. They have to be much more fair to other countries, including the United States, or we're not going to be involved with them anymore. We'll do it a separate way. Okay?
Many of the accusations in Trump's letter were leveled at China. Beijing dismissed the claims as deflection from US domestic failures to contain COVID-19.
The open letter from the US leadership is full of assertions and speculation, trying to mislead the public by feeding them vague information in order to discredit China's hard work in epidemic control and prevention, an effort by the US to shed responsibility for their own incompetence. This is futile.
Trump rejected multilateralism and, it seems, science, announcing he is taking the controversial drug hydroxychloroquine. Studies have indicated that it is risky for those with underlying heart conditions and over 70 years old.
It doesn't hurt people. It's been out on the market for 60 or 65 years for malaria, lupus, and other things. I think it gives you an additional level of safety.
The president's own top health officials have warned people against using the drug. Fears are some Americans may now ignore that advice. And at a cabinet meeting, the US president continued to blame China for the spread of the virus and called into question that Phase 1 trade deal signed here at the White House back in January. The White House continues to point the finger as the cases in the US are over 1.5 million and deaths over 90,000. Nathan King, CGTN at the White House.
And on that note, let's shift focus to China. The country recently launched several new laws and amendments to further reform and open up its economy. Now, the loan prime rate is the country's new benchmark lending rate that is quoted monthly by 18 banks. The rate remained unchanged in May, with the one-year LPR standing at 3.85% and the above 5-year rate at 4.65%. Here's a look at how it works.
China's central bank used to set the interest rate that commercial banks can charge their customers for their loans. In August 2019, the People's Bank of China revamped the system to let commercial banks refer to the loan prime rate, or LPR, to price new loans. LPR is the rate commercial banks charge their most creditworthy customers. It was set by 10 major banks. The reform expanded the pool to 18 financial institutions, and they set the LPR on the 20th of every month. Compared with the benchmark interest rate, LPR better reflects the market situation for loans. The reform also saw the interest rate decrease, reflecting the need to lower financing costs for the real economy. The one-year LPR has fallen to 3.85% from 4.25% when the reform was launched, and the 5-year LPR, which mainly affects mortgages, dropped to 4.65% from 4.85%.
Well, CGTN's Michael Wang now explores some of the accomplishments of the loan prime rate reforms so far.
China's interest rate reform that made the loan prime rate, or LPR, the new benchmark rate for businesses and households, has guided down borrowing costs in the real economy. Before loan prime rate reforms in August 2019, banks had an implicit interest rate floor of 0.9 times China's previous benchmark interest rate. The previous benchmark rate hasn't moved since 2015, so an interest rate floor based on a multiple of that means lending costs to businesses didn't go down much. That's despite China's central bank having already liberalized lending rates, and despite the central bank providing cheap funding to commercial banks. It was a monetary policy transmission challenge. But after LPR reforms, the pipes of monetary policy transmission flowed much smoother. The implicit interest rate floor, keeping borrowing costs higher than it should be, was completely shattered. According to the People's Bank of China, as of mid-April, nearly 30% of all new loans issued had interest rates below 0.9 times the previous benchmark rate. That's 3 times as much compared to before LPR reforms. LPR reforms don't just benefit big companies. It's critical, too, in lowering financing costs for medium-sized, small, and micro businesses, which make up 99.8% of all legal entities here in China.
The benefits of LPR reform has 3 major benefits for small and medium-sized companies. First, it improves the channel of monetary policy transmission and provides a more efficient tool to decrease interest costs for the real economy. As a result, the drop in average corporate low rates has been larger than decreases in the low prime rate. Second, after reforms, the 8 additional banks included to set the LPR rate are banks that specialize in catering to the funding demands of SMEs and can meet their demands in a quicker and more targeted way. Third, as the new benchmark, the LPR supports a wide expansion of structural policies targeted at SMEs, including the recent relending and rediscount tools.
The next step in LPR reforms are already in motion. All floating rate loans issued in 2020 are benchmarked on the loan prime rate, but outstanding floaters still use the old benchmark interest rate. China has announced that outstanding floating rate loans must also transition to LPR-based contracts. Banks are currently negotiating with clients to do so. And when the transition is complete by August, China's central bank says the ability of a lower LPR to translate into lower borrowing costs for small businesses will be even more effective. China's loan prime rate reforms are better reflecting changes in the supply and demand for financing. Lending rates become more market-based, and reforms ensure that changes in borrowing costs actually serve the real economy.
Well, let's head to Portugal now, where bars, cafes and restaurants have reopened. The country has a low coronavirus caseload, despite having an aging population and the lowest number of ICU beds in Europe. Well, CGTN's Mia Alberti in Lisbon reports on what went right in the country and what still needs to be done.
For the first time in 2 months, the most famous pastry shop in Lisbon finally reopens.
It was a difficult decision to close for the first time in 43 years, but today we are excited to reopen and do what we do best.
I came here today to help this iconic house and also to give this sweet gift to family and friends. I'm sure they already miss these pastries a lot.
Restaurants, hairdressers, museums and most shops are also reopening. A sweet reward as Portugal maintains one of the lowest number of confirmed coronavirus cases per capita in Europe. Dr. Filipe Frões from the COVID-19 task force says Portugal had time to prepare, with the virus arriving later than in Spain and Italy.
We had precious days to implement a strategy that allowed us to prepare our hospital response. We also introduced the state of emergency and confinement measures earlier than these countries, so those measures had more impact.
Portugal quickly closed schools, borders, and closely monitored patients placed in home isolation. The number of ICU beds was increased by 35%. However, patient demand never reached full capacity. Most citizens also stayed at home despite the absence of a mandatory lockdown. The government says other restrictions might be lifted soon, like resuming religious services or football games, if the situation continues to improve.
The data is clear. We had a slowdown in the rhythm of new cases, fewer hospitalizations, fewer people in the ICU, a lower number of daily deaths. We have increased our testing capacity, so the criteria we set to control the pandemic has been fulfilled.
The government warns, however, that full safety from the virus won't be possible until there's a vaccine. Until then, social distancing and masks are part of the new normal. The Prime Minister has said he will have no problem in reintroducing the state of emergency if cases begin to rise again. So the situation will be reassessed every 15 days. And that's to give authorities some time to keep the pandemic under control and avoiding the economy into falling into yet another financial crisis. Mia Alberti, CGTN in Lisbon.
Well, let's shift focus now and take a look at how commodity markets performed. Oil prices firmed up today on signs of improving demand and a drawdown in U.S. crude inventories. As you can see, Brent crude was up almost 4% on the day. Now, analysts say fundamentals in the market are improving thanks to supply cuts and as easing of lockdown restrictions worldwide helps to boost demand. But of course, weak crude refining profits still persist, which of course could delay a recovery in oil demand. Meanwhile, gold prices gained on bleak data from major economies. Investors are still holding on to gold as a safe haven asset. Let's take a short break now, but still coming up on the show. We'll tell you about an app that's enabling Zimbabweans in South Africa beat restricted cross-border movements and send food home.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Continental, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Now, social enterprises are coming to the rescue to provide some of the most sought-after essential items during the coronavirus pandemic. In Nigeria, hand-washing basins made with drums may be one of the newest features in public places, serving the needs of hundreds of people. Here's CGTN's Deji Badmus with the rest of the story.
Adams Bangwoshe is only 10 months old in recycling, and business is really booming for him this season. He reuses waste materials such as tire and metal drum in making essential products. But the specially carved hand-washing drums with fitted soap dispensers have now become his signature.
I felt I could explore using my creativity and artistry in creating something that can be essential to curb the spread of COVID-19 in Nigeria. Those drums are not useful to the manufacturers that use the products in them. So as a recycler, instead of them bending them or selling to those that will turn them into something not valuable, I buy from them, then I reuse them in making something more useful and essential.
Bangwoshe does the entire work from scratch to finish himself, with help from some friends. He made his first hand-washing drum for personal use by improvising with hammer and chisel before getting a grinding machine. After posting images of the outcome on social media, he started to get several orders, and from what started off as a single trial, his hand-washing drums are now one of the most sought after by major stores and supermarkets in Lagos.
My target audience are store owners, schools, factories, markets, and places that people visit often to get their daily needs. So what makes my mobile wash hand basin special is the fact that it has an infrared control tap. One does not really need to touch the tap for it to be controlled, and it is mobile, meaning people can bring it out in the morning and bring it in the evening.
Bangwoshe says infusing painting on the drums is a deliberate attempt to encourage hand washing at a critical time like this by making it appear fashionable. He's happy that his innovation is not just fetching him money, but helping to stop the spread of the coronavirus in Nigeria and keeping the environment rid of waste. Deji Badmus, CGTN, Lagos.
And with cross-border movement restricted because of COVID-19, Zimbabweans in South Africa are now using an app to send food to relatives in their crisis-hit homeland. The app is called Malaicha, which is Ndebele slang for the traditional way of sending goods over the border with bus and taxi drivers. Use of the app did surge in April. Here's CGTN's Alexandria Majala with more.
Malaicha is an app that lets people in South Africa buy groceries for others in crisis-hit Zimbabwe. Zimbabweans living and working in South Africa have been paying bus drivers to ferry food to their relatives back home for decades. However, since the coronavirus pandemic hit, the app has seen a massive surge in the use of its services month on month in April.
The lockdown and the shutdown of the borders between South Africa and Zimbabwe forced Zimbabweans who would traditionally use the informal means of sending goods and groceries to Zimbabwe to use our service, to actually explore it, try it. So 200% increase in the number of orders processed. The number of unique customers sending those orders is slightly less than that. We saw a 100% increase in the number of unique customers. And obviously those customers enjoyed the service and sent more than just one transaction during the lockdown period.
Efforts to stem the spread of the virus have seen Malaicha, which is a word that refers to the traditional method of sending food items, become impossible under lockdowns. Aside from that, the method is both costly and unreliable. Now, customers make their order via the app and the company delivers the goods to Zimbabwe, where it has stores of the items in warehouses. Only around a year old, Malaicha has yet to break even and needs to scale up its usage. Its journey to profitability, however, will be longer than a typical startup due to the high costs for things like warehousing. But since the pandemic hit, business is booming.
With this lockdown, we're very busy because a lot of people in South Africa are depending on Malaicha to use Malaicha to send groceries to their relatives here. So it's busy. Every day it's busy.
It's busy. Every day, busy.
Before the lockdown, Malaicha handled an average of 20 to 30,000 orders a month, but that number spiked by around 200% in April. Its user numbers, meanwhile, rose by around 100% to 75,000 as people normally suspicious of apps were forced out of their comfort zones by the regulations. The app is fairly affordable as traditional Malaicha services can cost up to 3 times more and provide no recourse if the goods don't show up. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Now, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has hit many restaurants hard. Their operation hours have decreased due to curfews and lockdowns. Many of them have also been forced to lay off workers. Now, despite all these challenges, a restaurant owner in Egypt has won the hearts of many by preparing free meals for the needy. Here's CGTN's Adel El Marhoui with his story.
Ibrahim al-Masri owns this restaurant in Cairo. Usually at such a time, he'd be in his office remotely monitoring operations. But this is a special order, so he's meticulously inspecting every step of the preparation of meals. All these meals will be given out as charity.
In regular times, whenever a poor person passes by asking for help, we give them a meal. When the pandemic happened, many sectors stopped working and many day workers got affected. To save their dignity, we decided to present these as an offer instead of making people feel like they need to beg.
Ibrahim placed a banner on the restaurant's entrance. It reads, "We are with you until this crisis is over." Surprisingly, he's leading this noble effort at a time when his business has been strongly hit by the COVID-19 pandemic.
The government has banned dine-in services and some people are now afraid to order food fearing infections while others cannot afford to buy the food. Our workload has dropped by about 75%. The restaurant has been really affected, but I refuse to play the victim's role. In such times like this pandemic, everyone must help out. We cannot abandon people in the times of need.
The holy month of Ramadan is popular for the public dining meal services. Tables are set up in the streets offering free iftar meals when the fasting ends by sunset. But this year, the government has forbidden this service as it imposes its social distancing measures.
Families are now depending on us greatly. When Ramadan began, we realized that they need this service more, so our responsibility became bigger. Public Ramadan dining tables were stopped, so that has put more pressure on us because poor people now don't have an option.
The giveaway meals include salad, fruits, juice, animal protein, and rice. The restaurant started this initiative by supporting 5 families. It now serves 150 families daily. Ibrahim has been leading this inspiring charity work since Egypt reported its first case of COVID-19 on March 17 to date. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Well, before we go, let's check in on Africa's currencies today. Kenya's shilling held steady. It was supported by tight liquidity in the local money market. That, of course, countered dollar demand from importers today. Meanwhile, South Africa's rand's comeback seems to be gathering momentum now. The currency advanced a third day to its strongest level in 5 weeks. It breached 2 key resistance levels that stood between it and further gains. Now, the market is in a wait-and-see mode ahead of tomorrow's South African Reserve Bank verdict on the rate. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From